Kremlin's secret black agent, who watched Stalin execute 8 generals and lived to expose the shadow in the labyrinth. The air in the Kremlin was a perpetual chill, a cold that seeped not just into the bones but into the very soul. It was 1941, and the war, a ravenous beast, gnawed at the edges of Mother Russia. Yet within these ancient walls another, more insidious war was waged. I was a shadow in that labyrinth, a ghost among the living, my presence acknowledged by few, my purpose known by fewer still. My name, for the sake of this narrative, is Mikhail. To the NKVD I was a cipher, a useful tool. To myself I was a man teetering on the precipice of an abyss, my moral compass spinning wildly in the magnetic field of absolute power. My skin, dark as the deepest Siberian night, was a constant anomaly in the pale, often fearful faces that scurried through the Kremlin's corridors. I was an outsider, yet intimately woven into the fabric of its darkest secrets. Recruited from the shadows of a Georgian orphanage, trained in the brutal arts of observation and infiltration, I was Stalin's unseen eye, his silent ear. My role was simple: listen, watch, report, never question, never feel. But the human heart, even one encased in the ice of survival, has a stubborn way of beating to its own rhythm. The war with Germany had begun, a cataclysm that had caught the Soviet Union unprepared, despite all the intelligence Stalin had dismissed. The initial losses were staggering. The retreat a bloody, chaotic nightmare. Panic, a silent contagion, spread through the highest echelons of power, and with panic came paranoia. Stalin, a man whose distrust was as boundless as the steppes, saw traitors in every shadow, saboteurs in every setback. His purges, which had decimated the Red Army's officer corps in the late 1930s, now threatened to consume what little leadership remained. My quarters were a small, Spartan room deep within the administrative wing, a place where the sun never touched the windows. From there I could access a network of hidden passages, listening posts, and observation points that crisscrossed the Kremlin. I moved like a whisper, my footsteps absorbed by thick carpets, my presence masked by the constant hum of activity and the pervasive fear that kept heads down and eyes averted. I saw things, heard things, that would curdle the blood of lesser men. The whispered accusations, the sudden disappearances, the hollow-eyed officials who returned from interrogations as broken shells. I remembered the stories from my youth, tales of Job, a man tested beyond endurance, stripped of everything, yet clinging to a sliver of faith. I often wondered, in the quiet solitude of my hidden posts, what Job would have done in the Kremlin. Would his faith have survived the suffocating weight of injustice, the casual cruelty, the systematic dismantling of truth? I was not a man of overt faith, not in the traditional sense. My faith was in the unseen, in the quiet dignity of resistance, even if that resistance was only internal. I believed, perhaps foolishly, that there was a line, a boundary beyond which even the most hardened soul could not step without losing something essential. I was watching for that line, for myself and for the men I was ordered to observe. One evening, a summons arrived, a terse note delivered by a grim-faced NKVD officer. The leader requires your presence. Room 17. The very name sent a shiver down my spine. It was not Stalin's personal office, nor a formal meeting room. It was a place of shadows, of hushed accusations and swift, irreversible judgments. I knew what it meant. Another purge was brewing. The air grew heavier with each step I took towards that infamous room, the weight of impending doom pressing down on me. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the silence. I was a witness, yes, but also a potential victim. In Stalin's Kremlin, the line between observer and observed was perilously thin. I adjusted the small, concealed microphone in my sleeve, a relic of my training, and prepared to enter the heart of the storm. The door to room 17 was thick oak, soundproofed, and guarded by two hulking NKVD men whose eyes were as dead as the winter landscape outside. They nodded curtly, recognizing my status as one of Beria's special operatives, and allowed me entry. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with cigar smoke and unspoken dread. Stalin sat at the head of a long, polished table, his eyes, those piercing, intelligent, yet utterly merciless eyes, scanning the faces of the men assembled. Beria, his chief of secret police, stood beside him, a reptilian smile playing on his lips. Around the table sat a collection of high-ranking military officers, their uniforms immaculate, their faces pale and drawn. 8 generals, their chests heavy with medals, their careers forged in the crucible of revolution and civil war. Now they sat like lambs before the slaughter. My role was to be unseen, I slipped into a small, darkened alcove behind a heavy velvet curtain, a vantage point from which I could observe every nuance, every flicker of emotion. The air crackled with tension. Stalin began to speak, his voice deceptively calm, almost paternal, yet each word was a hammer blow. He spoke of betrayal, of incompetence, of the motherland's suffering. He spoke of enemies within, of those who sought to undermine the Soviet state in its hour of greatest need. The generals shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between Stalin and Beria, a silent plea for mercy that would never be answered. I felt a cold dread settle in my stomach. This was it, the beginning of the end for these men, and I, Mikhail, was to be the silent witness. Subscribe to uncover more untold WWW secrets. The generals, once proud commanders, were systematically dismantled. Their achievements were twisted into evidence of ambition, their failures magnified into treason. One by one they were paraded before the leader, their voices trembling as they confessed to crimes they had not committed, their eyes pleading for an end to the torment. I watched from my hidden alcove, my heart a leaden weight in my chest. The cigar smoke, thick and acrid, burned my eyes, but I dared not move, dared not even blink too often. Every detail had to be absorbed, every word recorded, every gesture noted. This was my duty, my courage. I saw General Kuznetsov, a hero of the Civil War, break down, tears streaming down his weathered face, as he admitted to being a Trotskyite saboteur. His confession was a hollow echo in the room, a testament not to guilt, but to the crushing power of the state. My mind drifted to the story of Job again, how he sat in ashes, his friends offering hollow comfort, urging him to curse God and die. These generals too were in their own ashes, their reputations, their lives, being systematically destroyed. And like Job, they were being asked to confess to sins they hadn't committed, to betray their own truth for a fleeting hope of mercy that would never come. I felt a profound sense of kinship with their suffering, a silent empathy that was dangerous in my line of work. My training had taught me to be detached, to be an unfeeling instrument, but the sheer unadulterated injustice, unfolding before me, chipped away at that facade. The accusations grew more outlandish, more fantastic. Plots to assassinate Stalin, plans to surrender to the Germans, collaboration with foreign intelligence. Beria's voice, a low, menacing purr, filled the silences, adding layers of fabricated detail to each charge. He presented evidence, forged documents, coerced testimonies from other prisoners, that painted a picture of a vast conspiracy reaching into the very heart of the Red Army. The generals, exhausted and terrified, offered only weak denials, quickly overridden by Beria's relentless interrogation. I observed Stalin throughout. His expression remained impassive, a mask of cold judgment. Occasionally he would interject with a sharp question, a rhetorical flourish, designed to further corner his victims. He seemed to relish the power, the absolute control he wielded over life and death. It was a chilling display of tyranny, a stark reminder that in this regime, justice was a malleable concept, shaped by the will of one man. As the night wore on, the generals' resistance crumbled completely. Their confessions became more elaborate, more self-incriminating. They implicated others, names whispered in desperation, hoping to deflect some of the wrath. It was a chain reaction of fear, each man pulling another down into the abyss with him. I knew that these names would lead to more arrests, more interrogations, more confessions. The purge was a hydra, and these 8 men were just the first heads to fall. My own position felt precarious. What if I, Mikhail, was next? What if my silent observation was deemed insufficient? My loyalty questioned. The thought was a cold hand gripping my throat. I had seen enough to know that no one was truly safe, not even those who served the leader directly. The only way to survive was to be indispensable, to be invisible, and to never, ever show weakness. But how long could one maintain such a facade when confronted with such profound evil? The sun began to paint the eastern sky with faint streaks of gray. When Stalin finally rose, his gaze swept over the broken men at the table, a look of grim satisfaction on his face. "The motherland thanks you for your honesty," he said, his voice devoid of warmth. "Your confessions will serve as a warning to all who contemplate betrayal." He then turned to Beria. A slight nod, a silent command. Beria, ever efficient, immediately dispatched his men. The generals were led away, their faces etched with despair, their steps heavy with the knowledge of their impending doom. I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that I would never see them alive again. The weight of what I had witnessed pressed down on me, a burden that felt heavier than any physical chain. I was alive, yes, but at what cost? Like this story of Stalin's secrets fascinate you. The following morning the Kremlin was abuzz with hushed whispers. The official announcement was terse. 8 high-ranking generals of the Red Army have been arrested for treason and counter-revolutionary activities. They have confessed their crimes, and will face the full judgment of the Soviet state. The euphemisms were transparent. Everyone knew what full judgment meant. It meant a swift, brutal end. My orders were to continue my surveillance, to observe the reactions of other officials, to report any signs of dissent or unease, but my mind was no longer solely focused on my duty. The images of the generals, their broken faces, their forced confessions, replayed endlessly in my thoughts. I felt a profound sense of defilement, as if the evil I had witnessed had stained my very soul. This was the crucible, the ultimate test of my internal joy. Could I endure this suffering, this witnessing of profound injustice, without succumbing to despair or complicity? The executions took place that very night, in the deepest, most secure part of the Kremlin's inner sanctum. I was not ordered to witness them directly, but my network of hidden passages and listening devices allowed me an unparalleled, horrifying proximity. I was positioned in a ventilation shaft above the execution chamber, a narrow, dusty space where the air was thick with the metallic tang of fear and the faint scent of disinfectant. Through a small grate I could see into the chamber. It was a stark concrete room, dimly lit by a single bare bulb. Beria was there, his silhouette a menacing figure against the wall. 2 NKVD officers, their faces grim and impassive, stood ready, and then one by one, the generals were brought in. Their uniforms were gone, replaced by simple rough tunics. Their hands were bound, their mouths gagged. Their eyes, however, still held a flicker of defiance, a desperate plea for dignity in their final moments. The first general, Kuznetsov, was pushed forward. He stumbled, then stood tall, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the walls. A single shot echoed, deafening in the confined space, and he crumpled. The sound reverberated through my very bones, a physical blow, then another, and another. 8 times the gun fired, 8 lives extinguished, 8 men murdered in the name of a paranoid dictator. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the shots themselves, a heavy, suffocating blanket of death. I remained in the ventilation shaft long after the bodies were removed, long after the chamber was cleaned, long after Beria and his men had departed. My body was numb, but my mind was a maelstrom. The injustice was so blatant, so absolute that it shattered something within me. I had always believed there was a purpose to my existence, a reason for my survival, for my unique position. But what purpose could there be in merely witnessing such horror? Was I merely a cog in this monstrous machine, an accessory to murder? The story of Job came back to me, not as a distant tale but as a living, breathing question. Job, who lost everything yet refused to curse God. He questioned. He grieved. He demanded answers. But he did not surrender his integrity. I had not lost everything. Not yet, but I had witnessed the ultimate betrayal of justice, the systematic destruction of innocent lives, and in that moment, a new purpose began to solidify within me. I could not bring these men back, but I could ensure their deaths were not in vain. I could expose the truth. The decision was not made lightly. It was a terrifying, life-altering choice. To expose Stalin was to sign my own death warrant, to become the hunted instead of the hunt. But the alternative, to remain silent, to continue to serve the regime that had committed such atrocities, was a fate worse than death. It was the death of my soul. My escape began subtly, meticulously. I had spent years mapping the Kremlin's hidden passages, its blind spots, its vulnerability. I knew the shift changes of the guards, the patterns of patrols, the locations of the few unguarded exits. I began to gather evidence, not just the recordings from Room 17 and the execution chamber, but also copies of Beria's fabricated reports, internal memos detailing the purges, anything that could prove the systematic nature of Stalin's terror. It was a dangerous game, each stolen document, each whispered conversation, a step closer to discovery. The weight of the truth was unbearable, but it also fueled me. It gave me a strength I didn't know I possessed. I was no longer just Mikhail, the shadow agent. I was Mikhail, the keeper of a terrible secret. A secret that had to be brought into the light, no matter the cost. The path ahead was fraught with peril, but the alternative was a life lived in complicity, a life I could no longer bear. Comment below, what would you have done in this situation? The escape from the Kremlin was a blur of adrenaline and calculated risks. I moved through the labyrinthine passages like a phantom, my years of training now serving a purpose far beyond what my handlers had intended. The documents, carefully concealed in a waterproof satchel, were my burden and my salvation. Each rustle of a guard's uniform, each distant shout, sent a jolt of fear through me. But the memory of the 8 generals, their silent pleas for justice, pushed me onward. My route led me through forgotten tunnels, beneath ancient foundations, and finally to a seldom-used service exit, near the Moscow River. The night air was biting, a stark contrast to the suffocating warmth of the Kremlin's interior. I slipped into the darkness, a single solitary figure disappearing into the vast, indifferent city. The first hurdle was cleared, but the real challenge lay ahead. How to expose the truth to a world that might not want to hear it, and how to survive in the process. I spent weeks in hiding, moving from one safe house to another, relying on a network of old contacts and newfound allies who, like me, harbored a deep-seated resentment for Stalin's regime. These were not grand conspirators, but ordinary people, a disillusioned printer, a sympathetic railway worker, a former academic whose family had been purged. They risked everything to help me, their quiet acts of defiance, a testament to the enduring human spirit. The war raged on, dominating headlines and consuming global attention. Exposing Stalin's internal purges during such a critical time was a delicate, dangerous endeavor. Many in the West, desperate for an ally against Hitler, were willing to overlook the Soviet Union's internal brutality. I knew I needed to present irrefutable evidence, a story so compelling that it could not be ignored. My plan was audacious. I would seek asylum in a neutral country, Switzerland, and from there release the documents and my testimony to the international press. The journey was arduous, fraught with checkpoints, suspicious officials, and the constant threat of discovery by NKVD agents, who I knew would be hunting me relentlessly. I traveled by night, on foot, by train, by boat, a ghost traversing a war-torn continent. Each border crossing was a gamble, each encounter a test of nerves. Finally, after months of perilous travel, I reached the Swiss border. The moment I stepped onto neutral soil, a wave of exhaustion washed over me, but also a profound sense of relief. I was safe. My mission, however, was far from over. I contacted a prominent Swiss newspaper, presenting myself as a former Soviet official with critical information. Skepticism was their initial reaction, but when I produced the documents, the signed confessions, the internal NKVD reports, the detailed accounts of the executions, their skepticism turned to shock. My testimony, delivered with the raw emotion of a man who had witnessed unspeakable horrors, filled in the gaps, painting a vivid picture of Stalin's reign of terror. The story broke like a bombshell. Kremlin agent exposes Stalin's purges. 8 generals executed for treason. The headline screamed across Europe and America. The world, preoccupied with the war, was forced to confront the dark underbelly of its Soviet ally. My account, corroborated by the undeniable evidence, detailed the sham trials, the coerced confessions, and the cold-blooded murders of men who had served their country. The reaction was immediate and very. The Soviet Union vehemently denied the allegations, branding me a traitor and a liar, a Western provocateur, but the evidence was too strong, my story too detailed. Western governments, while officially maintaining diplomatic ties with Moscow, were privately appalled. The truth, once hidden in the Kremlin's shadows, was now out in the open, a stark reminder of the moral compromises being made in the fight against fascism. My act of exposure did not bring down Stalin, nor did it immediately halt the purges. The war continued, and the alliance held, but it planted a seed of doubt, a crack in the carefully constructed facade of Soviet infallibility. It gave voice to the voiceless, a posthumous vindication for the 8 generals and countless others who had perished in Stalin's terror. My life, of course, was irrevocably changed. I lived under constant threat, a marked man, forever looking over my shoulder, but I carried no regret. The burden of truth, once so heavy, had transformed into a purpose. Like Job, I had witnessed profound suffering and injustice, but I had not cursed the light. I had chosen to bring light into the darkness, to expose the evil, even at great personal cost. My final reflection is this: courage is not the absence of fear, but the triumph over it. Integrity is not merely adhering to a code, but standing firm in the face of overwhelming pressure to compromise. The Kremlin, with its ancient walls and its modern horrors, taught me that the greatest battles are often fought not on battlefields, but within the human heart. And sometimes, the quiet act of bearing witness, and then speaking that truth, is the most revolutionary act of all. The 8 generals may have died in silence, but their story, through me, finally echoed across the world, a testament to the enduring power of truth against tyranny. Subscribe now for more historical narratives that changed history.